principio. También está
Muy buenos días. La Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México les da la más cordial bienvenida a la inauguración de la Conferencia Comité Internacional de Documentación CIDOC 2023, Fronteras del conocimiento, Museos, Documentación y datos enlazados. Presiden este acto la doctora ANGÉLICA GUADARRAMA, directora del Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas de la UNAM. Así. La doctora GARZA, directora general de Artes Visuales del Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo. El doctor PABLO MORA PÉREZ-TEJADA, director del Instituto de Investigaciones Bibliográficas y de la Biblioteca Nacional. La doctora TRILCE Navarrete Hernández, integrante del Comité Internacional de Documentación. Y el doctor Pedro Ángeles Jiménez, coordinador de la Conferencia 2023 y académico del Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas. Damos la más cordial bienvenida a autoridades universitarias, a los ponentes y oradores de esta conferencia Comité Internacional de Documentación CIDOC 2023, a los invitados del Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas, del Instituto de Investigaciones Bibliográficas y del Museo Universitario Arte Contemporáneo, así como a quienes a través de redes sociales hoy nos acompañan. Señoras y señores, sean todas y todos ustedes bienvenidos. Para dar inicio a este acto, tiene la palabra la doctora ANGÉLICA GUADARRAMA.
Otra bienvenida. Buenos días a todas y todos. A nombre del Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas, doy una calurosa bienvenida al público que nos acompaña en este auditorio y, por supuesto, a las autoridades que comparten conmigo este presidium, los anfitriones del CIDOC, el doctor Pablo Mora PÉREZ-TEJADA y la doctora Amanda de la Garza, que generosamente han abierto las puertas de la Biblioteca Nacional y el MUAC para acoger esta conferencia. A la doctora TRILCE Navarrete Hernández, presidente del Comité Internacional del ICOM, CIDOC, y desde luego al doctor Pedro Ángeles Jiménez, que desde hace cerca de 18 meses ha trabajado incansablemente para hacer realidad este día en el que se inaugura la conferencia del CIDOC por primera vez en México. Hoy se dan cita en este foro, tanto de manera presencial como virtual, cerca de 150 profesionales de museos de todo el mundo dedicados a la documentación del patrimonio cultural y artístico, con el propósito de intercambiar ideas y avanzar en el conocimiento respecto a cómo dar un mejor tratamiento a la información de museos, entender cuáles son las problemáticas de esta documentación frente a fenómenos como la fiabilidad de los datos o la inteligencia artificial. Es bajo el título Fronteras del conocimiento, Museos, Documentación y datos enlazados que este encuentro de larga tradición, que se lleva a cabo desde 1991 en distintas partes del mundo, hoy busca proponer soluciones a cuestiones urgentes como el tráfico ilícito de bienes culturales, así como entender la relevancia de los datos bien estructurados, la importancia de los estándares internacionales y el estudio de las tendencias en tecnologías de frontera que hoy son una realidad. El patrimonio cultural de México, que se encuentra en el espacio público, en las galerías, en los sitios históricos y, por supuesto, en los acervos de los museos, son la materia de trabajo de nosotros, los historiadores del arte. Es por ello que desde el Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas, desde hace casi 90 años, realizamos esfuerzos día con día para su registro, resguardo, rescate, difusión y salvaguarda. Quiero dar las gracias a Pedro Ángeles y al Comité Científico por traer esta necesaria discusión a nuestra universidad y hacer de esta semana una gran fiesta de la documentación museística en nuestro país. Finalmente, quiero aprovechar este momento para agradecer a los equipos del Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo y de la Biblioteca Nacional de México por haberse sumado con tanto entusiasmo y compromiso a esta conferencia. Muchas gracias, desde luego, también al equipo del Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas que ha coordinado cada aspecto logístico de esta celebración. No me queda más que desearles una fructífera y enriquecedora jornada en la que se tejan y fortalezcan redes para nuestra comunidad de museos y documentación del arte a nivel mundial. Muchas gracias.
Tiene la palabra el doctor Pablo MORA PÉREZ-TEJADA.
Buenos días a todos. Y bueno, es un gusto para la Biblioteca Nacional de México estar en un evento como este tan importante. Precisamente nosotros estamos trabajando en un nuevo sitio con datos enlazados, que espero que pronto tengamos una presentación sobre estos aspectos. Por lo pronto, agradezco por supuesto la invitación. Para nosotros es un honor que nos inviten a este tipo de conferencias, una conferencia tan importante, además de que tenemos ya mucho tiempo trabajando con el equipo de investigaciones estéticas y otros, por supuesto, como la Dirección General de Repositorios, presidido por Tila Pérez. ¿En dónde radica la transformación de las fronteras entre el conocimiento y la documentación de museos y bibliotecas? Frente al entorno digital en que vivimos, me parece que en varios aspectos, las tecnológicas y las jurídicas, las patrimoniales y las subutilitarias, las privadas y las públicas, entre otras. Sin duda, nos encontramos en una era tecnológica en donde la forma como transmitimos y consumimos información o bienes patrimoniales ha cambiado, de la misma manera en que la transmisión y generación del conocimiento se ha transformado. Es por ello que instituciones responsables de la preservación, ordenamiento, recolección, difusión de los bienes culturales y artísticos, como bibliotecas, universidades y museos, asumen el reto para discutir estos nuevos desafíos a través de la discusión entre especialistas para buscar establecer verdaderas estrategias que sirvan para garantizar esa nueva transmisión del conocimiento. Una responsabilidad que debe reconocer la importancia de saber armonizar estándares de preservación digital con la difusión de los objetos y libros, o que busque normativas y políticas públicas entre el acceso abierto y los derechos de autor, o bien que sepa armonizar cuestiones tecnológicas como el uso de la inteligencia artificial o ponderar la función de los bibliotecarios o las bases de información debidamente contextualizadas para evitar información poco objetiva y sesgada. Sin ir muy lejos, la inteligencia artificial como tecnología del conocimiento representa un desafío que aún no se ha discutido lo suficiente, particularmente si consideramos los sesgos morales, biológicos, etcétera, que se pueden derivar del tipo de información y algoritmos que la constituyen. Estas máquinas del conocimiento que logran analizar bases de información digital en niveles profundos y que mal usadas pueden utilizar datos, inclusive personales, y generar nueva información y aprendizajes con intenciones tendenciosas, aún no armonizadas con cuestiones como el derecho de autor, resultan riesgosas al poder socavar valores como el de la objetividad, la igualdad y el de la información confiable. No me cabe la menor duda de la necesidad de estos congresos y conferencias convocados esta vez por CIDOC, la Conferencia del Comité Internacional de Documentación. Estos representan las bases para sustentar un mundo que sepa generar cimientos sólidos para el presente y el futuro de nuestras generaciones y que aspiran a vivir un mundo más democrático en una sociedad abierta y digital. Muchas gracias.
Hace uso de la palabra la doctora TRILCE Navarrete Hernández.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos a nuestra conferencia anual de CIDOC. Agradezco a la doctora ANGÉLICA VELÁZQUEZ GUADARRAMA, a la doctora Amanda de la GARZA y al doctor PABLO MORA PÉREZ-TEJADA por su tan amable bienvenida de estar aquí con ustedes. Es una especial trilogía, supongo, que apunta a prometedores futuros en lo que se refiere a armar puentes para mitigar las fronteras de conocimiento, museos, documentación y datos enlazados. That's right, CIDOC, Frontiers of Knowledge, Museums, Documentation and Linked Data. Our annual meeting to exchange ideas and make plans for future joint actions. CIDOC is the oldest international committee of documentation with a history back from the 1950s. CIDOC is the recognized expert and core resource in documentation of museums. We're also one of the largest international committees with over 700 members. We have an active membership base and a wide network at global level, a community of international professionals working to advocate and advance documentation best practice. We also have a close collaboration with other international committees, such as COMCOL, the International Committee of Collections, CIMCIM, the International Committee of Musical Instruments, and increasingly we're working together with INTERCOM, the International Committee of Management, Museum Management, and ICOM-CC, the International Committee of Conservation. Our work focuses on advocating for the adoption of documentation standards, developing tools to support documentation, including standards, facilitating knowledge exchange of a professional network, and exchanging in communication and training activities with the global museum community. And this is because museum documentation is closely linked to all activities of the museum. Museum documentation is key to all museum activities. In CIDOC, we believe documentation enables the regeneration of knowledge, as we will hear later on from our keynote this morning. I want to end by thanking also the previous chair of CIDOC, Monica, who has unfortunately not been able to join, but she's joining us online. She has been not only generous, also visionary in the shaping of CIDOC in the last 2 terms. As a new elected chair of CIDOC, born in Mexico City, I am thrilled to welcome you to our annual meeting. Please be sure to turn around and meet and greet others around you, exchange with those who you don't know, as we have several CIDOC new members, and we have a few members to be. So please welcome everybody to our annual conference. I wish you a very fruitful exchange, bridging across frontiers of knowledge. Thank you.
Escuchemos la intervención del doctor Pedro Ángeles Jiménez.
Muy buenos días, estimados miembros del presidio presente aquí, estimados amigos en el auditorio. Quienes vienen de lejos sean bienvenidos a México, a nuestra casa, la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Para quien vienen cerca, qué alegría volverles a ver reunidos en un evento tan relevante como nuestra conferencia anual CIDOC 2023. Estamos desde la documentación de museos, cómo formalizar los sistemas de documentación para enlazar datos, para generar información, para establecer qué contenidos y narrativas dan relevancia a los objetos culturales que resguardan nuestras organizaciones del sector cultural. Esta conferencia es la primera que hacemos en tiempos de pospandemia. Aun cuando el COVID sigue presente, la incertidumbre parece ahora menor y podemos planear una conferencia híbrida. Fue la anterior de Tallinn, y no totalmente virtual como lo fue la de Ginebra. Quizá para algunos de ustedes haber llegado a México sea su primer vuelo internacional después de estos tiempos recientes y viajar nuevamente y hacer posible el efecto de cariño de estrecharnos las manos, no de lejos en una pantalla, sino en este auditorio. Como podrán imaginarse, la convocatoria se pensó para hablar de museos, su documentación y cómo enlazar sus datos. Ya desde el taller de CIDOC CRM que ocurrió en días previos, pudimos advertir que formalizar nuestra información con las mejores prácticas resulta relevante para cualquier futuro que consideremos posible. Por otro lado, con la idea de fronteras de conocimiento, aludimos al hecho de que cualquier frontera solo es una construcción imaginaria, jamás un límite o una barrera infranqueable. En 2014 tuve la oportunidad de asistir a mi primera conferencia de CIDOC. Aquella se realizó en Dresden. El cómo pasó fue realmente afortunado. Nuestro entonces director, el doctor Renato González Melo, recibió una invitación de parte de INCOBU para asistir a la reunión que ahí se celebraría en el grupo de trabajo del Standard Living. Ahí conocí los trabajos de CIDOC paulatinamente, que hace a favor del patrimonio cultural y la formación de normas internacionales. También tuve la oportunidad de conocer a varios redactores de estándares, del IDO, de CIDOC CRM, de lo que hace CIDOC siempre. O todo el empeño puesto en la agenda que se tiene, siempre llena de objetivos, como la formación de vocabularios, estándares, que hoy pueden consultarse libremente. Lo que inició aquel año no pudo ser más afortunado. Pues escuché la conferencia magistral de Murtabaka, a quien extrañamos ahora, o al resto de la comunidad de CIDOC y sus trabajos, quedando, como espero que queden los asistentes que vienen por primera vez a la conferencia, gratamente impactados por la generosidad y calidad académica y humana de sus participantes. Entonces, se me ocurrió preguntar si habían visto por aquel entonces alguna persona de México, y el único nombre que vino fue el de Felipe Acotur Fornelli, reconocido arquitecto y museólogo mexicano, fundador de la Gaceta de Museos, quien había fallecido casi una década atrás. También recuerdo otra anécdota. En alguno de los eventos sociales charlaba con Gordon McKenna, quien amablemente me dijo: ¿por qué no hace usted una conferencia en México? Tardamos como bien una década en hacerlo y por fin aquí estamos reunidos. El largo camino en el tiempo ha sido propicio. Después de todo, yo tengo para mí que esta conferencia, más que resultados, es el inicio de un futuro promisorio. Después de todo, venimos formando algo. Durante el mes de agosto tuvimos 3 conversatorios sobre documentación en México y una jornada sobre convergencia en UNAM. Desde hace poco, más de un año, iniciamos los preparativos que nos trajeron aquí. Desde hace un mes, entre la comunidad mexicana del patrimonio cultural, se habla de documentación. Tengamos, como siempre, una conferencia rica en contenidos y seamos bienvenidos todos. Muchas gracias.
A continuación, escuchemos el mensaje inaugural de la doctora Amanda de la GARZA.
Hola a todos y todas. Desde el MUAC, por supuesto, les doy la bienvenida. Estamos hoy reunidos para pensar, conocer y aprender las formas del archivo y la documentación en la contemporaneidad. Para mí la pregunta central radica en pensar el objetivo de la preservación y el patrimonio en un mundo en crisis, en donde los museos también se han transformado, y en donde existen profundos cuestionamientos respecto de su pasado y sus otros. Hoy en día debemos cumplir nuestras tareas patrimoniales asociadas a la definición clásica del museo. Sin embargo, nuestra contribución a la historia y a la sociedad va mucho más allá hoy en día. Algunas de las preguntas abiertas que formarán parte sin duda de esta conferencia, de qué manera podemos divulgar nuestros acervos, acercarnos a la sociedad de otras maneras, cómo podemos releer nuestras colecciones, contar otras historias, de qué manera podemos abordar los vacíos que existen, de qué manera las colecciones contribuyen a la noción del bien común, los derechos humanos, por supuesto, en la historia y en la memoria. Cómo estos objetivos sociales determinan nuestra labor. Hay, por supuesto, preguntas más prácticas asociadas a las anteriores, pero no menos importantes, cómo podemos lograr obtener el financiamiento necesario para implementar, capacitar, desarrollar estrategias, procesos de infraestructura digital, de qué manera podemos contribuir a que el acceso a los procesos digitales y a la transformación digital relativa a la documentación no sea nuevamente el resultado de la brecha entre países ricos y pobres, de qué manera podemos conversar con los desarrolladores de tecnología para tener herramientas que sirvan a las funciones y a las tareas sustantivas de nuestras instituciones. Como ven, tenemos muchas tareas pendientes. Estoy segura que será un evento sumamente enriquecedor para todos los presentes, que además reúne, tenemos el privilegio de tener a muchísimos colaboradores a nivel internacional que día a día contribuyen a estos objetivos comunes. Además del gozo, como ya mencionaba el doctor Pedro Ángeles, de estar presentes cara a cara para pensar juntos. Este encuentro no sería posible sin el concierto de personas e instituciones. En ese sentido, quisiera agradecer la invitación a formar parte de este encuentro del Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas, a su directora ANGÉLICA VELÁZQUEZ, a la Biblioteca Nacional y al Instituto de Investigaciones Bibliográficas, a su director, el doctor PABLO MORA-TEJADA, a CIDOC Internacional y su presidenta TRILCE NAVARRETE, a México y su presidenta Gabriela Gil, y por supuesto al doctor Pedro Ángeles, miembro de CIDOC, el investigador del Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas, que por muchos años ha sido un muy cercano colaborador del museo. Y por supuesto al equipo del MUAC, a Sonia Nero, curadora de acervos documentales, que formó parte del comité científico, y al resto del equipo del museo, que hace posible que estemos hoy en día en este encuentro. Y bueno, con estas palabras damos por inaugurada la conferencia de CIDOC 2023, Fronteras del Conocimiento, Museo, Documentación y Datos Enlazados. Gracias.
Eso sí, como damos por concluido este acto inaugural, les invitamos a continuar con la conferencia inaugural The Social Responsibility of Documentation, Contextualizing Data, la responsabilidad social, contextualizando datos, que presenta el doctor Dominic Oldman del British Museum y que será moderada por la doctora TRILCE. A todas y todos ustedes, muchas gracias. Buenos días.
Lo que pasa es que your keynote on a USB or
Él quiere ocuparse. Ya tengo te la doy.
sí. Ok. Él lo quiere hacer en personal.
No podemos.
Tenemos que saber. Tenemos que iniciar la reunión. Tengo que we have to start the Zoom connection.
Es que no sé si tienes un por aquí se hace
The only issue I've got is just seeing words.
So you rather have a movie?
Approaching with the hands. Yeah.
Okay.
Nada más déjame ver cómo se ve la conexión.
Ah, no.
tengo la clave. Es enviar la clave de la conferencia es esta.
Tendría que entrar aquí a su sesión, sí. Necesitamos entrar a su Zoom. Sí, pero no porque necesitamos una dirección de correo válida. Déjame decirle a
So it's going to give me an email.
Join meeting, schedule a meeting. Anyway, if you want to join a meeting, join. Okay, the meeting code is 8:45, 29:57.
29:57, 14:32.
14:32. Ok, me va a pedir la clave. ¿Es Open Link? Launch meeting. Okay, el password es
19:43, 53, 71.
Join.
No, aquí no es un no, es 8:45.
Otra vez.
19:43.
19, 43, 53, 53, 71.
But it was a long one. I'm still recovering.
No, intentamos con el. Es que yo he puesto esto. A ver, intentamos con esto. Trajimos los beneficios. Es
No, no, es meeting ID.
Es verdad.
YZ.
Y
Y mayúscula, Z minúscula,
P, X,
P minúscula, PX,
ajá, V mayúscula,
V,
9,
Okay.
signo de interrogación, 7,
Okay, fine.
Okay.
9.
It's a lot in it. But I did it.
Okay.
Entonces, John, hay que desactivar video. Questions are seguindo copiándolos.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I see.
Ya.
Share screen. No. Desactivar video.
Will I
Y
be?
el audio. Ya, looking for the audio. Ahora se dice
Everybody's in trouble.
Para conectar el audio. Pero ya.
It's okay.
El video, entonces vamos a compartir.
I just need a box or something.
¿Hiciste, Bruno? Share. Okay.
So if I do the slideshow here, I put into the presentation. Does it work?
Sí, estoy. Nada más audio y
Pero falta un poco. No. Sí, pero tiene
So close. Do you want me to sit? I just need to be close enough so I can see the words. And you can do this, can't you? Yeah. I think I might need to sit still. My eyesight's starting to go a bit this week, so I'm. Oh, it should be. So it's on presentation mode. So it needs to go into. So when I go to presentation, it's just mirroring. So when I go to here, where I need to read, it does the notes. It doesn't show. So it should be showing this. Yeah.
Because that's nice. The other thing we can do is we have two laptops with one with the. You have this. It's getting complicated. Yeah, I can.
So if I share this presentation, it's going to be difficult when it doesn't.
Because of the phantom Gmail, you mean?
Because I'm going to have to operate two computers to do the slides.
Yes.
So,
I can switch, when you switch one, I can help switching the other one.
okay, so in notes, I've actually put the slides, prompted the
I'll
slides.
just follow you.
Yeah.
That's easier.
Okay, so you,
But then how do you put your, how do I see your slides here?
okay, so if I, it's awesome. So if I share this with you,
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
as well.
so if I share,
Se podrá. No.
can you put your email into here? For people.
That's what you do. ¿I got it? Ok, entonces usamos esta. Está bien, gracias.
Oh, hello. Technology.
It's not very
This is still not going to work, is it, though? Because I need to be on the notes page, and therefore the slides page needs to be on yours, doesn't it? So you need to switch over. So if I'm reading the notes, slides need to be on yours, therefore they have to be projected on the screen. So is that possible? You can share your screen to this.
Do you need to then add Zoom?
But it's not come through yet.
No.
Yeah, US needs to. We can do that. US needs to. So,
Webinars online. just let you know that Dominic is a historical researcher who has done lots of work and support to translate, let's say, the work that we do as researchers, as historical researchers, using digital tools. He's been working at the British Museum and now heading his own endeavors, but I don't want to take more time. I will give you the word.
Thank you very much. I'm thinking about changing the keynote to why we should go back to paper records, but let's get on with it anyway. I want to thank the CIDOC for inviting me to contribute to the opening of this year's conference. It's a great honour to help support the overall theme of the week, and I have the privileged opportunity to make some initial comments for the proceedings, which I hope are helpful. I wanted to start by giving you some historical context about me. My first degree was in law back in the day when I was choosing my degree subject. Like many students, I found it difficult and I didn't really know what I wanted to study. A teacher of mine suggested that perhaps I should read law. Law was considered a general, solid degree with prospects. This was at the end of the 1980s, when universities were approaching the end of a progressive period in which many of the disciplines, including the social sciences, were teaching curriculums using a very different worldview, and therefore a very different approach to education. This was just before universities became more commercially driven and disciplines started to be more narrowly defined. The progressive approach recognizes changes in the way that new knowledge was being produced in response to a more complex and interconnected world. Disciplines realized they could not address increasingly complex questions for existing Cartesian methods, splitting things and processes down to the most reducible parts, because the whole was more than the parts, that specialization was missing the big picture, and that homogenization meant losing valuable knowledge. Instead, new knowledge processes start to be seen as naturally transdisciplinary, and they address dynamic processes, not static things, and they try to take account of change and transformation. They were more historically driven. Much of the heritage sector has not really been part of this fundamental change in approach, despite many academics in museum studies pleading with museums to understand and adopt different perspectives and to communicate the complexity. Oh yeah, sorry. Sorry. No, I've gone on to the next one. Yeah. So I'll start that again. Much of the heritage sector was not really part of this fundamental change in approach, despite many academics in museum studies pleading with museums to understand and adopt different perspectives and to communicate the complexity of social and historical connections of their collections and beyond. Museums were not really part of this new movement from the static to the dynamic, and from the disciplinary or subdisciplinary to the transdisciplinary, from the intrinsic to the relational, at least in part. A conference was even held and a book produced called The Two Art Histories, comparing the approaches of social history-orientated academics and that of materially-orientated curators. So I'm going to go back to that. Lecturers running the course that I was on felt that to be a good lawyer, learning the statutes and case law and how to navigate the courts was not enough. Students needed to understand how law related to society as a whole. The degree was called Law in Context. In family law, it was not enough to know the legal technicalities of divorce, and it was important to understand the history of property rights for women, the causes and impact of domestic violence, and the effect on law on children and changing attitudes towards what constituted a family. It was not enough to be able to technically advise someone arrested at a police station. You needed to understand the bias in the system, the motivations behind the laws, like stop and search, and the implications generally of new criminal laws and for human rights and civil liberties. Oops. You needed to understand the history of penal practices and their effect on prisoners. It was not enough to memorize judges' decisions. You needed to understand the culture from which judges originated and which guided their decisions. And you needed to understand the philosophical underpinnings guiding judges' approaches. By putting law in context and understanding how laws change in relation to society, we could better understand the processes of law. One thing was certain: static laws eventually produce bad laws. In documentation, we've reached a point where simply providing references, binding aids, and catalogue indexes simply doesn't address the new challenges and answer the questions being asked of us. And they don't address the challenges of communicating and interacting with larger, more diverse communities in modern information infrastructures. The world and society has changed, but some of the fundamental laws and rules which govern museum documentation have remained relatively static. And static documentation, at some stage, produces bad documentation. It also reflects lack of direction in terms of the social role of museums, particularly in a global digital knowledge society. A famous 20th century British business consultant, Peter Drucker, who coined the phrase knowledge worker and advised businesses on transitioning to what was once called a knowledge society, a term that's rarely used today, said that knowledge has to be improved, challenged, and increased constantly, or it vanishes. Anthony Griffiths, a former keeper of prints and drawings at the British Museum, and who sponsored the museum's collection online system, a project that I managed, said that a system constructed for inventory purposes was absurdly limiting and dangerous. He talks about keeping records in line with the latest scholarly information. But progression also means expanding the categories of knowledge to reflect social needs. Addressing the needs of wider audiences means clearer and explicit meaning, addressing significance and relevance, and accepting contributions from external communities. He also commented, like Drucker, that information walked out of the door the day that any curator retired, and his or her successor had to start all over again. New documentation needs to be continually changing documentation, and it needs to be constantly contextualizing and interconnecting to answer bigger questions. The subject of this talk is documentation and social responsibility. The theme of the conference is documentation, knowledge, and linked data. All these aspects are interconnected and point to this new approach to documentation, and in particular, more sophisticated structured forms of digital documentation. If we are going to use linked data as a medium for documentation, then we need to understand how it communicates with people and supports knowledge generation. Structured information has become a crucial part of digital information infrastructures, and all museums, large and small, have become global communicators. But the internal processes of museums have not evolved to address this type of global communication on the web of data. Our public data publication processes are just that, publications of existing forms of data based on information systems and standards that reflect a data administration approach that doesn't address the wider categories of knowledge necessary to fulfill new educational needs and address social responsibilities. It's become clear that we've built up a legacy of documentation records that are anachronistic, lacking adequate context, and which embed racist, sexist, and generally discriminative narratives, both implicitly and explicitly. New technology does not by itself change this, and I don't say this lightly, and I'll produce examples during this talk. Language is one issue, but others include a lack of attention to historical and social research, which should be used for contextualization, correcting and remedying omissions. The lack of new and important categories of knowledge going beyond the traditional intrinsic museum record is highly problematic both internally, because it inhibits the progression in back office processes, which themselves become anachronistic, and externally in the strength of our relationships with communities interested not simply in objects in themselves, but with the knowledge that surrounds objects, a semantic network of information. Documentation should be a continual process, and there should be little difference between practice, knowledge processes, and what we call research. The fundamental role of the museum in assembling objects and maintaining them with a specific intellectual environment emphasizes that museums are storehouses of knowledge as well as storehouses of objects. The objective of this talk depends on the extent to which we understand the potential value of documentation as a social asset, a prioritization in dealing with diversity and inclusion, and a commitment to the removal of institutionalized discrimination baked in by previous documentation methods, technologies, standards, and management practices. As Ray Bradbury alludes, we are now regularly pumping out data to the web which is lacking in real substance and integrity. Cram them full of non-combustible data, chop them so damn full of facts they'll feel stuffed, so absolutely brilliant with information, they'll feel their thinking, they'll get a sense of motion without moving. And they'll be happy because facts of that sort don't change. Don't give them any slippery stuff like philosophy or sociology to tie things up with. That way lies melancholy. I will argue, for example, that only semantic knowledge systems moving away from databases can provide a progressive documentation strategy, because traditional databases lack the necessary semantics and the ability to accommodate transdisciplinary interconnections or adequately represent historical change, and should be phased out as part of our new definition of documentation. There have been many promises by technologists to resolve the issue of documentation with new forms of database technology, but this is illusory. As the historian Eric Hobsbawm said, one of the big issues addressing history with technology is an ahistorical, engineering, problem-solving approach by means of mechanical models and devices. We need to pay far more attention to content rather than simply replicating legacy data in new technical structures. The generation of knowledge is not achieved by a computer and a technology like linked data, which is simply a technical structure, but by humans. The question is how technology augments our intellectual processes. Structured documentation should provide a meaningful, evidence-based content communicated in a way to allow humans to generate and contribute new knowledge. What does social responsibility for museum documentation look like in the digital world? Given that our data is being openly published and potentially reused, if the data has any value by many different communities, we have to have high standards of accuracy. This means that we must constantly review our documentation. We need to provide adequate context so that the underlying narratives are not distorted or hidden. To avoid this partial narrative, we need to stop limiting the categories of information we're allowed to use, and which are not currently part of administrative documentation standards. We need to represent the historical significance and current relevance of items we curate. We need to directly challenge information that contains errors, prejudice, and bias. This type of documentation requires a greater degree of complexity, but not a complexity that we need to be afraid of, but that we need to embrace to overcome the intellectual overhead of using reductive data, which ultimately means fragmentation, duplication, and ineffectiveness without sufficient practical benefits. Unless we embrace the authorship of detailed and changing patterns of structured information, we'll not be able to contribute to the history of society as a whole. If we do not prioritize and rethink documentation, the risk is not just that objects go missing, which in itself is a serious matter, but we lose the knowledge that makes those objects significant in the first place. A general lack of priority in documentation is a serious cause for concern for a whole variety of reasons that go far beyond the museum inventory. Museum documentation has been greatly influenced by library cataloguing. Early examples of library catalogues include the Sumerian archive in the city-state of Uruk, around 3400 BCE, the cuneiform tablets that were recorded in the Royal Library of Ashburnipal in the 7th century BCE, and the Alexandrian Library in the 2nd and 3rd century BCE. Gradually, the documentation of objects started to run in parallel with bibliographic items, establishing at least an administrative connection between objects and associated textual works. But what was recorded was still effectively a type of index that we use today using vocabularies for categorization. It's worth noting that despite the fact that we have developed extreme specializations that fragmented museum and library expertise and information, many organizations now attempt to reverse this trend and in part mend this situation. The precursor to the museum was the medieval Wunderkammer. It had no catalogue or index. It was viewed as a microcosm designed to evoke knowledge about the world. In this unordered environment filled with objects, the visitor was able to construct their own semantic networks and contemplate the interconnections and dependencies that cross between the natural and the artificial. Visitors, unconstrained by object labels, could arrange these objects in a way that was meaningful to them. The Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben said that only seemingly does chaos reign in the Wunderkammer. However, to the mind of a medieval scholar, it was a sort of microcosm that reproduced in its harmonious confusion the animal, vegetable, and mineral macrocosm. This is why individual objects seem to find their meaning only side by side with others, between the walls of a room, in which the scholar could measure every moment the boundaries of the universe. In the digital world, the Wunderkammer is far broader and far more complex. From the 17th century, in many countries, the commonplace book became a means for people to keep a record of knowledge they had accumulated from books and experiences. They were perhaps an early form of database, a personal record, but with more flexibility and no fixed data model. It wouldn't be long before someone tried to formalize the commonplace book with technology. Thomas Harrison's Arc of Studies allowed these snippets of information to be organized in a cabinet full of paper hooks with a subject index which allowed cross-references. Scientists like Gottfried Leibniz, considered a philosophical force behind modern computer science, wanted to use this invention to organize information and collaborate with colleagues. But the vision was far bigger than the clunky technology can handle. Harrison's vision was to compile all the special and distinct notions existing in all books. Someone commented that even though this is a task on a colossal scale, he thinks it need not be despaired of, since any number of people, 10 or 20,000 say, can be involved in collecting the material. It was a task, as Hartleb said, for the whole human race. This vision was that building knowledge was collaborative and a participatory activity. If only we could combine our shared resources, we could create and maintain something like Harrison's vision. But despite the internet and the World Wide Web and our powerful computer technology, we seem as far away from Harrison's vision. In fact, we seem to be going in the opposite direction. The web has become a perfect example of fragmentation hiding in plain sight. More and more people, including the web's creator, Tim Berners-Lee, see a dysfunctional environment which works against knowledge building and which we accept and conform to. This may be in some way, as James Bridle says, because of computational thinking, the product of oversimplification, bad data and deliberate obfuscation, which allows us to recognize the ways in which it fails and reveals its own limitations. Charles Babbage, credited with as being the inventor, at least in design, of the computer, had no grand plan for world knowledge. It was a machine that could take over the work of humans and reduce the cost of training and employing them. He set in motion intellectual machines to break the artisans' guilds, using the combined principles of Cartesian scientific reductionism and Adam Smith's equally reductive division of labor as inspiration. His vision of the machine or computer was an object of control, a precursor to Taylorism and scientific management, a tool of modern capitalism that impeded the knowledge and judgment of workers. Its tradition continues in the digital world as digital Taylorism, represented by a growing, hidden, low-paid workforce, filling in the gaps left by machines, just as those created for the factories that Babbage tried to automate. However, as a new optimistic modernist vision appeared in the 20th century, the vision of Thomas Harrison's Arc of Studies was taken up once again by Paul Otlet, who laid the foundations of modern information science. He and others like him thought that the communication of knowledge would help promote peace and collaboration across the world. He created the Universal Decimal Classification System, a hugely sophisticated subject indexing system, which makes today's subject categories look flat and lifeless. At one stage, it had over 200,000 classifications, which could be semantically connected, allowing transdisciplinary cataloging. His Mundanium, an information city, would facilitate peace and common understanding. Otlet believed that books carried the history of all books that came before them. They overlap with one another, repeating and amplifying, but at the same time expanding and changing knowledge over time. Science was historically driven. Books represented an evolution of knowledge. Otlet said that books conserve mental energy. What is contained in books passes to other books when they themselves have been destroyed. And all bibliological creation, no matter how original and how powerful, implies redistribution, combination, and new amalgamations from what is previously given. Books contain an evolving dynamic, building a provenance of knowledge. He created a new technology, the microfiche system, a temporary mechanism, but he anticipated that people would eventually access a Mundanium from devices with screens in their own homes. Today, the classification is still used in organizations interested in detailed information exchange across national borders and languages. However, regardless of the sophistication of its index, it is still ultimately an index, unable to represent the social, economic, and political context in which these subjects existed. It was still mundane. In archiving, the concept of conceptual reference means not only a physical arrangement, but their collections are organized using an intellectual arrangement, which is derived from an understanding of the historical context in which things or processes are created, used, and connected. And those intellectual arrangements will change over time as new knowledge is discovered. Going back to the computer, the database was invented in the 1960s by Charles Backman. It was then called the Integrated Data Store. He wasn't an academic, but part of a new generation of computer engineers working in commercial data processing departments. His motivation was not even close to that of Harrison and Otler. He just wanted to make computers more accessible and efficient for processing supply chain information. The process of taking raw materials, creating finished products, and distributing them to customers. There was no need to think about wider context. This just got in the way of bulk processing, storage, and retrieval, what IT people call scale. Even today, when a system is appraised, the question is still, does it physically scale, but never does it intellectually scale. By bringing together different data tools into a data management system, he made computer systems affordable to more companies who cannot afford to create their own custom systems. It was the beginning of a growing demand for off-the-shelf products that took a function and created an intrinsic model aimed once again at reducing cost of ownership to the owner of the capital. It wasn't designed for users. The database system that Backman created is more or less the same as the databases we use today. They have no semantics, which impedes their communication and interoperability beyond the walls of the owning organization. You can't easily change their data models to accommodate new creative thinking, forcing you to arrange your thinking elsewhere and to necessarily fragment information. It does not allow the information to be arranged in different patterns and relationships for different questions, and creates a production line which inhibits thinking. The gap between documentation and new approaches to knowledge production has been getting wider and wider. In the disciplines of history, historians investigate in wider and wider sources, making connections that are rarely represented in digital information systems. So we should be far more aware of how scholars now work and to capture more of the information they produce. Scholars investigate questions for long periods of time, collecting vast and varied information. They then create different patterns of the empirical facts they've created to support interpretations. And finally, these interpretations are converted into textual narratives. But the patterns and relations of facts are lost, but they really should be documented. These investigations involve abstractions from the real world and from real world sources. And there's a direct connection between those sources and the abstractions and notes that they make. When they are asked to abstract their abstractions into a database, they not only have to conform to a fixed model, but the real world connection to the sources is compromised. This is known as a theory of instrumentation. It therefore doesn't support the skills and knowledge of people working in documentation. Database systems are designed so that they can only deal with one function. Their lack of formal semantics limits the complexity of the data they can practically manage. Language structure is the basis for accurate orientation in the world, so long as it displays relevance with respect to the structure of the fragment of reality to which it refers. Establishing this relevance is not possible in any other way than through empirical findings. Without them, the meaning of the linguistic structure and the actions based upon it become irrational and inadequate. Ultimately, reality coerces adjustment, although this is done at great expense on a trial by error basis, which is always connected with a high risk of failures, which cannot be undone. A map is not the territory, words are not the things they represent. The technical explanations of how digital communication is conducted is based on Shannon's theory of communication, which is purely focused on whether a message can be transmitted and remain intact when it is received at the other end of a communication. This theory is liberally explained in digital humanities courses, but in no way does it explain how meaning is generated in the receiver. This has been called the information paradox. The answer is that knowledge is generated by the receiver using the references that they know, like an Agamben's Wunderkammer. But in the complex modern world of digital data communications, we need to provide more meaningful reference. Quoting Martin Dürr, Knowledge is a particular relation you can relate to its reference and you can justify. No machine can recognize a reference. Therefore, only humans can know. All scientific and historical knowledge is based on evidence. Encoded knowledge is information. Processed information becomes new knowledge in the recipient if the relation to the reference is preserved and the justification back to the original evidence is transparent. This is a strong aspect of the CIDOC CRM. And one of the reasons its use continues to grow. It is a dialectic necessity, a logical solution to the contradiction of information without knowledge. It meets the demands of a new documentation. No computer system will be perfect and free from constraints, but we can do much more by adopting semantic relational systems of documentation and empirically benchmark our language, and which can better represent our sources or evidence. Linked data is a broad term, but precisely it is just a technical metamodel, a structure for carrying data, albeit through the web of data. Linked data provides a vehicle for semantic networks, but it's the content that we must ultimately be concerned with. If structure rules over content, then we can actually structure. Okay, I don't have to. Hello? If structure rules over content, then we can it's gone. Structure rules over content. Oh, hello. Testing. The other microphone was working. Hello. Okay. If structure rules over content, then we cannot create textually aware documentation. In databases, it's the structure that rules. It is the technical instrumentation that rules. And I say again that you should be contemplating the removal of databases and using systems that are about community knowledge building. There is little benefit in transferring like-for-like legacy data from databases to linked data. It must be conducted with a view to expanding the categories of knowledge, and linking data should ultimately be about authoring and supporting a dialogue that builds knowledge and expertise. Linked data becomes useful when it's coupled with a framework that supports meaningful content. And this is what the CIDOC CRM provides for. The creation and development of the CIDOC CRM is by far the most significant innovation in museum and wider documentation. It should never be compared, put in the same box as traditional standards that have evolved out of database and data processing mindsets. It's been developed to address many of the challenges that I've mentioned. It does what no computer scientist has come close to doing, describing historically based knowledge domains in a way that is semantically and universally accurate, but also allowing us to go far beyond our specializations and to be transdisciplinary. It promotes the dynamic improvement of information. It supports a diversity of knowledge and its manipulation according to our thinking. Digital thinking about the world becomes efficient. The focus should now be to help people to transfer to this new way of working. I said that I would illustrate my statement about anachronistic and discriminatory information, which itself provides empirical evidence supporting the argument that we need to change our view of documentation. And I've chosen a couple of examples, although I might be able to get through both of them. But I haven't chosen them out of thin air. So the methodology, can't really see it very clearly. The methodology is to take a 17th century catalogue and choose examples that have sufficient information to allow me to compare them to current documentation. I want us to go through the research that I undertook to prepare these case studies to try and support my claims. I put before you an early catalogue of Don Saltaro's coffee shop, whose original proprietor was James Salter. The catalogue, often vague, provides an important marker for understanding the extent to which our processes change over time as part of our understanding how society changes over time. While the technical processes and structure might have changed, the content may not have. James Salter had been a servant of Hans collection formed the basis of the British Museum collection. Sloane provided Salter, along with others, objects he could display in the coffee shop to entertain and provide focus for discussions about the world. This is the first item that I'm going to go through. It's an amulet or charm given by the fetishists or priests in Guinea to the credulous natives. Each division contains some Arabic characters. These poor deluded wretches believe that whilst they're suspended around their neck or otherwise carried about them, they'll be safe from thunder, slavery, or other casualties that the priests chose to say they will be preserved from. This viewpoint, typical of the time, seeks to mock and denigrate a West African religion and associated religious objects, similar to the ones that are used in many parts of the world, including the West. There are examples of these objects in many museums, and they can be identified through generative AI systems like ChatGPT. Despite the nature of Saltero's description, I can take the context and wording it provides, and without mentioning an object type from a vocabulary, I can ask the following question. What item was worn around the neck by people in Guinea, West Africa in the 18th century to bring good luck and provide protection, including protection from slavery, and contained Arabic text? I'm using context such as period, place, event, concept, proposition, all semantic types of processes covered by the CIDOC CRM. ChatGPT identifies this information, speeds it up, and returns with the answer that it is a grigri. It adds some additional information that the scripture it contains is from the Quran and states that they are an integral part of the spiritual and cultural practices in West Africa. They provided a source of psychological support and hope for those who carried them in the face of such challenging circumstances. We now have an object type, a grigri. And if we look this up in a popular online encyclopedia, we find that this object is also described as a voodoo object. This is an object associated with West African religion, brought over to the Americas by the slaves, where it remains a significant religious object. For example, it's worn by the slaves in the Haitian Revolution, an insurrection against their French colonial oppressors. Going back to ChatGPT, we can ask what events in history are relevant to the grigri. We get the answer. And these protective amulets were worn by slaves during their journey across the Atlantic. They were used, as we said, in the Haitian Revolution, but also in many other Caribbean revolts. And they were used as symbols of resistance. They were also worn during the American Civil Rights Movement. In fact, the correct spelling of the West African religion is, in fact, Vodou. The word voodoo, as scholars have investigated, is a Western word that is used to promote a negative image and is now used interchangeably without distinction. It has become ingrained in our culture. If we go back to ChatGPT and ask the question, is voodoo a Western construct? We have to be careful. Our meaning is not clear, not explicit. The question is interpreted in terms of the religion, not the spelling. It simply says that voodoo is a valid religion originating from Africa and associates it with other spellings, including voodoo. If we ask a more precise question, the word voodoo, is the word voodoo a Western construct? Then this is now understood in the right context as a Western world, but at most just a simplification or a variation of the original voodoo. If we then asked whether the word voodoo is racist, the answer is not inherently, but it is associated with portrayals of African diaspora religions and their practitioners. In some cases, the term has been associated with harmful and offensive stereotypes in popular culture and media. However, we know there's been a large amount of material that tends to associate Black communities with criminality and activities designed to generate fear. In this piece on JSTOR Daily, it states that since slavery, tales of voodoo helped establish Black criminality as a social fact, and ultimately Reconstruction-era public voodoo narratives helped cultivate the ground for and served at least as a key forerunners to the public narratives of the Black Beast rapist, which defended Southern political violence for generations, Black disenfranchisement and legal segregation in Louisiana. If we go to another source, like the African version of Microsoft Encarta, it explains that voodoo includes spellings such as Vodun and Vodun, derived from a word for God and spirit, but never voodoo, the sensationalist and derogatory Western creation. Voodoo is a comprehensive system of knowledge that has nothing to do with the simplistic and erroneous images of sticking pins into dolls, putting hexes on adversaries, or turning innocents into zombies. It is an organized form of communal support that provides meaning to the human experience in relation to the natural and supernatural forces of the universe. We can clearly see how voodoo has been ingrained to the point of irony. In Wikidata, however, although there is an entry for voodoo, the same concept is also known as voodoo, which is seen as an alternative spelling. The image used to illustrate it is from an 1894 book of the world cultures called Ridpath's History of the World, and the image file uses the word voodoo. The Ohio State University digitally published the book as a historical record, saying Ridpath avoids the extreme Eurocentrism of many contemporaries, but nevertheless operates with explicit notions of racial hierarchy. He often refers to Africa as the dark continent and to Africans as savages, yet this is a source for the information for this record. In Wikimedia Commons, the book is categorized as scientific racism, but as I say, it's still used as a source. Most scholars agree that voodoo should not be used and tell us the extent to which the word voodoo has been used as a tool to demonize and belittle. But museum documentation is silent on all of this. They clarify and resolve nothing. They reduce the object to a static thing with no history or no significance. They make no comment on the relevance of the object in the present. There is a lack of interest in providing the context that this object necessitates for anyone coming across it online or indeed in the museum cabinet. Unlike ChatGPT, this record is hard to find in the catalogue. It can't be found by the words gree-gree, and it can't be found through most of the context provided to ChatGPT. This record illustrates important omissions, and there's no real way of adding them because it's in a fixed structure. Alfonso Constanzo was the leader of a drugs gang which committed brutal murders and eventually led to the death of an American citizen. He was associated with being an occultist. The book that you can see here, written by a journalist, is cited by scholars as having no basis in evidence or reality. There is no evidence of any association with African religions or that Constanzo based his reign of terror and death on it. But these associations are put forward under the headline of voodoo. This record documents many of the many papier-mâché figures used in the Day of the Dead celebrations. The Day of the Dead holiday both celebrates and honors friends and family who have died. It's part of the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Yet the book is cited here, perhaps partly because of the equally erroneous links to the religion of Santa Muerte. Constanzo had a statue of the saint, which itself has a different history to the Day of the Dead and is a growing religion, but it is not a deep devil-worshipping cult, quite the opposite. This represents a particularly poor example of documentation and a lack of duty of care to provide accurate information, absence of discrimination. The author of the record has decided to put in the curatorial comments a reference to the book called A Nightmare Tale of Drugs, Voodoo, and Death in Mexico for a description of narco-Satanists. There is no context or explanation of why the visitor might want to use this book and the purpose, but the association is made and it shouldn't be there. Alfonso Constanzo's criminal cult is linked to voodoo and Santa Muerte, representing a similar pattern of racist characterization. Both voodoo and Santa Muerte have been misappropriated by journalists, politicians, churches, and in this case, a museum. In the television series Penny Dreadful, the researchers Kate Kingsbury and Andrew Chestnut point out
the facts presented depict Santa Muerte as a so-called chaos demon. Such attributions reek of cultural misappropriation, misunderstanding, and neo-colonialism. Santa Muerte is not in any way linked to the devil, and to assume so is to suffer a colonial hangover. When the Spanish colonialists came upon the death deities of pre-Hispanic Mexico, they misconstrued them not as gods and goddesses, but as satanic figures, and forced indigenous people to abandon their worship at risk of torture, seeking to obliterate all local religious forms and replace them with Catholicism. Lastly, when we consult vocabularies like Getty vocabulary, but it's in other vocabularies as well, we see that voodoo is the preferred term instead of the correct term, voodoo, showing the way in which the term has been gradually conflated. I have another example, but I'm going to cut that one out because of the time that we spent this morning with the technical issues. But it's about peace pipe, and it's basically the same pattern, where peace pipe is taken up. There's no such thing as a peace pipe, and it's been taken by the media and other information sources to depict it as a belittlement and misunderstanding of Native American culture. But I'll go through these. I'll put these online, and you can look at them in your own leisure. So I'm going on to change, yeah. So there are a number of reasons why I wanted to highlight these issues in the keynote. The first is there's a problem talking about these issues. I attended one online meeting which discussed the lack of transparency on this subject, turning the record button to off, conscious that talking about these issues might lead to problems with their employers. Many museums have initiated projects which address some of these issues, but very few of them have integrated them into the everyday processes of their organization. On the one hand, it's a recognized problem, and on the other, public conversations are seen as problematic. The second reason is that for some time now, CIDOC has been developing a documentation framework that is capable of at least helping to resolve the documentation issues that I've been highlighting, the CIDOC CRM. But it'll take a lot more. It will need organizational backing in organizations where senior management are unaware of the possibilities. It will require the right systems in a sector dominated by traditional database collection systems. It will require a new way of thinking about documentation and a reversal of the decline in documentation professionals. And it is likely to need a new approach to participation in the writing of documentation. There is a huge, large legacy that fixing the problem is likely to require a participatory approach, which goes back to educating senior management. It also needs to highlight projects which are already making changes in their approach to heritage documentation. And I wanted to discuss quickly two current initiatives. One is a collaborative research project, and the other is an institutional system. The research project is PHAROS, a consortium with 14 European and North American art historical photo archives. It between them hold 28 million documentation records. They are or have been funded by the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Crest Foundation. Bringing together legacy records is itself a painstaking task, since all the organizations, despite fixed standards, use different data models, and over the years, data management rules have been broken. However, the first phase of data has been migrated to the CIDOC CRM, where semantic precision is being exerted, which necessarily resolves the data issues that exist in systems with no formal semantics. In other aggregation projects, the aim has been to create a common denominator model, a union catalogue, in which, as I've mentioned, homogenization leads to the loss of knowledge, and in some cases, it's distortion. It becomes a one-stop reference site or finding aid, and then itself becomes static. The approach of the project, the approach of the PHAROS project, recognizes that the whole exercise is pointless unless the resource becomes dynamic and the sources it was derived from are actively integrated into the knowledge graph. The second stage of PHAROS is to provide an interactive authoring environment in which the contributing organizations and others can start to expand the categories of information and add their ongoing work and thinking into the system. To survive, it needs to be continually changing and to do what internal documentation systems fail to do, respond to new scholarship and bring in a wider variety of views. It will allow structured arguments, allow the data to be arranged in different ways to support different viewpoints, support uncertainty, and be able to make use of the new CIDOC CRM extension new CIDOC CRM extensions like CRM Influence that help represent transformation and change and which allow researchers to show multiple sources of influence or causation. The second example is particularly important because it's an example of the first fully linked data information system being used in a museum, in this case in the Collection Care Department of the National Archives, as a core institutional system, specifically to break down the divisions and remove fragmentation internally, to raise the quality of information being produced, recognizing the level of expertise and knowledge in the department, and then using that dynamic to establish partnerships, provide educational materials, and to generally engage with the public. The Collection Care Department of the National Archives replaced their conservation database system with a CIDOC CRM knowledge base as part of a long-standing strategy of using a practitioner-researcher approach. The idea that everyday knowledge processes are in fact research and should be recorded at that level, coupled with the idea that using the paradigm, the information recorded at a higher level of detail could then be used for knowledge exchange. Moreover, specific research projects could use the system and this would be incorporated into the day-to-day. The National Archives in the UK contains a great deal of colonial papers, and conservation and science professionals also spend time understanding and documenting the historical and social nature of these papers. Having a system that allows transdisciplinary patterns of semantic information means that they can combine their technical information with historical information, building a far more representative picture of the work that they do. In addition to enhancing the level of information recorded about day-to-day activities, a broader knowledge base sits as another layer above, connecting to the day-to-day knowledge. It records methods and techniques and also historical context, information that the department builds up either through its normal program of work or through additional funded research. In this way, they can show how the department and its approaches change over time. The knowledge base will change and therefore day-to-day activities will reflect this change, connecting to an updated part of the knowledge base. The system will provide a provenance of knowledge useful to new, existing and future members of the department, but also through planned access, provide a knowledge base for people outside the organisation. Detailed conservation and scientific information can be stored and visualised, but at the same time, people can become the modelers of their own data and associate information to provide the context that makes the platform a valuable social resource, not simply an administrative database. In effect, the National Archive treats all sources of knowledge as part of the same interconnected knowledge graph. This means that when they are funded externally, they can demonstrate that all the outputs of research are incorporated into their core processes. Even specific applications developed for particular purposes become part of the same system, whether internal or external. Practice is research, and all knowledge ultimately comes from doing. And this is an example of new documentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Also for shortening this a bit, so we'll be able to follow the second example. Please feel free to ask Dominic questions in the coffee break, in the lunch, or afterwards. Just have a couple of things to say. If I were to summarize this lovely historic review of innovations in terms of information management and capturing knowledge, and I think what Dominic has just done is extend an invitation for you to be part of this new innovation that is absolutely needed. So please continue the conversation in a minute. Some house work. We have about short half hour. Thank you, Dominic. For those of you who are not staying in this site, to go to the other venue. It's very close. There will be somebody outside who can help you locate your session. It starts at 11. Sorry. Oh, yes, we are. Wait a minute. Yes, and so we're a little bit on the short side. Then we will have from 12:30 to 1, half an hour break, coffee, for everybody to start a conversation. From 2:30 to 4, we will have the lunch, and lunch is here outside in this building upstairs. So please feel free to join for the lunch or comida. We will finish at 5:30 the program here in the other venue. And we will have activities in this museum. So you are all welcome to visit the exhibitions. So thank you very much. Any questions? There's a number of colleagues. You can find them where you can ask questions. You can always ask. Thank you. So,